Hi guys, tonight we're stepping quietly into the life of one of the most enigmatic and misunderstood figures of the 20th century. This is the calm, drifting journey of Aleister Crowley, a man who called himself the Beast, yet spent much of his life searching for meaning, discipline, and a deeper sense of truth. In this slow retelling, we'll move gently through the early shadows of his story, touching the places where curiosity, loneliness, and ambition began to shape the person he would become. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Born Edward Alexander Crowley in 1875 to a wealthy and devoutly religious family, his childhood was marked by both strict discipline and profound emotional distance, a combination that quietly imprinted itself on the young boy's inner world. His parents belonged to a conservative Christian movement that emphasized obedience and moral purity, and while the household appeared orderly from the outside, the rules were heavy, and affection was something rarely expressed. Growing up, he found himself caught between two forces: a desire to fit into the expectations placed upon him, and an equally strong pull toward independence, imagination, and the unknown. Even as a child, he questioned the teachings that were presented as absolute truths, and this habit of questioning would follow him throughout his life. The atmosphere in his home gave him plenty of time alone with books, thoughts, and long stretches of silence, and those quiet hours slowly opened a door toward ideas that reached far beyond traditional religion. By the time he became a teenager, he had already begun to sense that the world was much larger, stranger, and more complex than anything he had been raised to believe. This early period of tension between conformity and curiosity did not erupt dramatically, but unfolded in a slow, steady drift, the way a river gradually changes course over many years. And it was during these quiet inner shifts that the foundations of the man he would later become started to take shape, one small question at a time, building a path that would eventually lead him far away from the world of his childhood. As Aleister moved into his teenage years, the distance he felt from his childhood environment grew quietly but steadily, shaping him in ways that were subtle yet powerful, like slow waves wearing down a shoreline over time. His father, once the dominant figure in his life, passed away when Aleister was just 11, and that loss created a quiet rupture inside him, one that left him searching for guidance in a world that suddenly felt less structured and far more uncertain. His mother, overwhelmed by grief and responsibility, reacted by tightening the strict rules of the household, hoping that discipline would keep her son on what she believed was the right path. Instead, the pressure only pushed him further inward. He began spending long hours alone, reading everything he could find, drifting from poetry to science to ancient philosophy, with the same calm curiosity that had followed him since childhood. There was something soothing in the way books opened new doorways, offering alternate ways of understanding the world, and with each passing year, his fascination with the unknown grew quietly stronger. At school, he was intelligent but restless, never fitting neatly into the roles expected of him. Teachers noticed his sharp mind and strong memory, but they also sensed that he seemed to be living slightly outside of the usual boundaries, as if observing life from a gentle distance. The more he was told to accept rigid truths, the more he gravitated toward ideas that encouraged freedom, exploration, and self-discovery. It wasn't rebellion in the loud, dramatic sense. It was more like a soft unraveling of old beliefs, replaced by something he had not yet defined but could almost feel taking shape. As he approached adulthood, Aleister discovered poetry, mountaineering, and long, quiet travels, each offering him a way to explore both the physical world and the inner landscape he had been carrying with him since childhood. These early experiences did not yet point to the figure he would later become, but they marked a gentle turning point, a slow shift from the structured upbringing he had known toward a broader horizon that seemed to pull him forward with steady, patient force. Deep inside, he sensed that his path would not look like the one laid out for him. And although he hadn't yet stepped into the life that would make him famous, the quiet foundations were already being laid, shaping the direction of his wandering spirit in ways he was only beginning to understand. As Aleister entered his years at Cambridge, the slow inner shifts that had shaped him since childhood began to form a clearer direction, though still in a quiet, unhurried way, as if he were drifting steadily toward a horizon he could sense but not yet see. Cambridge offered him something he had rarely experienced before: freedom. Not loud or reckless freedom, but a spaciousness of thought, a chance to explore without the constant weight of judgment or the strict expectations of his upbringing. He studied literature and philosophy, immersing himself in long evenings of reading, wandering and contemplation. The university atmosphere, with its old stone buildings and calm academic rhythm, provided a gentle backdrop for the questions that had been gathering inside him for years. Yet even in this peaceful environment, he often felt like an observer standing just outside the edges of ordinary life. While other students focused on predictable careers or the steady paths laid out by family tradition, Aleister followed a quieter, more inward current. He wrote poetry that blended emotion with a deep curiosity about the hidden layers of human consciousness. And though few understood the full meaning of his lines, the act of writing offered him a sense of calm and clarity. His interest in mountaineering grew during this period as well, and the mountains became a refuge where he could breathe more freely, away from the noise of expectations. There was something soothing in the patient rhythm of climbing. One step, then another, the air growing thinner, the world growing quieter, until all that remained was the gentle pulse of effort and the wide, empty sky. In these long climbs, he discovered a sense of focus and discipline he hadn't known he possessed, a reminder that the mind could be both expansive and steady at the same time. Around this period, he also encountered writings on mysticism, meditation, and ancient symbolic traditions, not through any dramatic revelation, but through the same calm curiosity that had guided him since childhood. These texts didn't provide answers, but they offered new questions, ones that felt strangely familiar, as if he'd been moving toward them long before he knew their names. Late nights became a quiet blend of candlelight, handwritten notes, and gentle explorations into ideas that reached far beyond conventional religion. Friends sometimes noticed a distant look in his eyes, a sense that he was listening to something they couldn't hear, but Aleister himself didn't yet understand where this subtle pull was leading him. What he did know was that he felt increasingly detached from the rigid beliefs he'd been raised with, and slowly, without confrontation or bitterness, he began to let those old structures fade. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like the way a shoreline gradually shifts over years of tide and wind. By the time he completed his studies, he'd become a young man shaped equally by curiosity, solitude, and an emerging belief that life held deeper layers waiting quietly beneath the surface. He left Cambridge not with a clear plan, but with a growing sense that his path would not be measured by traditional success. Instead, it would follow the quiet pull of exploration, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And although he had not yet stepped into the identity that would one day make him famous and controversial, the early threads of that future were already woven softly into his days, guiding him toward a world where discipline, symbolism, and a search for inner truth would slowly become the central focus of his unfolding journey. After leaving Cambridge, Aleister stepped quietly into a world that felt wider, looser, and filled with possibilities he had only sensed from a distance. There was no sudden transformation, no dramatic change, only a steady drift into independence, something he had long imagined but never fully experienced. With financial support from his inheritance, he no longer needed to follow a predictable path or rush into a conventional career. Instead, he allowed himself time to explore, moving through life with the calm curiosity that had shaped him since childhood. He travelled across Europe, staying in small inns, writing poetry in quiet rooms, and taking long walks through unfamiliar streets where he could disappear into the gentle anonymity of a foreign city. These were peaceful years, marked not by loud discoveries, but by a series of slow internal awakenings. He read more deeply than ever before, turning the pages of books on meditation, ancient symbols and early esoteric traditions with a patient fascination that grew a little stronger each day. Many of the ideas he encountered were subtle, about inner discipline, the structure of the mind and the value of self-observation, and although they didn't yet form a clear system, they resonated with something he had been feeling for a long time. There was comfort in the idea that the world might contain hidden layers waiting to be understood, and he approached these ideas not with fear or rebellion, but with a quiet longing to uncover something meaningful. His solitude during these years was not loneliness, but space, a gentle environment where his thoughts could stretch without boundaries. He filled notebooks with reflections that wandered between philosophy and personal observation, exploring how beliefs shape identity and how the mind responds when old structures begin to fade. Even his more adventurous pursuits like mountaineering became part of this inner journey. Each climb offered a sense of stillness and clarity, the slow rhythm of movement syncing with long stretches of open sky, creating a peaceful sense of distance from the world below. It was on one of these quiet travels that he first encountered a set of ideas that would gently redirect his life, teachings that suggested the possibility of a disciplined, structured approach to exploring the inner self. These teachings didn't strike him with dramatic force. Instead, they lingered in his mind like a faint melody he couldn't quite identify, something calm yet deeply compelling. He found himself returning to those ideas again and again, sensing in them a direction he had been unconsciously seeking for years. During this time, Aleister also began meeting people who shared his interest in philosophy and mysticism. The conversations were thoughtful and unhurried, often stretching late into the night as he and his companions discussed human nature, symbolism, and the possibility that consciousness might have depths that ordinary life rarely touches. These gentle exchanges helped him see that he wasn't alone in his questions, and they gave him a quiet reassurance that exploring these ideas was not a rejection of his upbringing, but a continuation of the lifelong search for truth that had begun in childhood. As he moved through this period of wandering, the pieces of his future began to fall slowly into place, forming the early outline of a path he didn't yet fully understand. There was no sense of urgency in his steps, only a calm willingness to follow the subtle pull that had been guiding him towards something deeper. And though he hadn't yet discovered the teachings that would later define his identity, he was already drifting quietly toward them, one thoughtful moment at a time, carried by the same patient curiosity that had shaped his journey from the very beginning. As Aleister continued his quiet travels through Europe, the threads of his inner curiosity gradually pulled him toward a more defined direction, though still softly, like a distant echo he was only beginning to make out. During this period, he found himself increasingly drawn to the idea that the mind could be trained, shaped, and expanded through patient discipline rather than dramatic experiences. This slow realization didn't arrive in a single moment. Instead, it drifted into his awareness during long evenings of reading, calm conversations with fellow travelers, and solitary walks through unfamiliar streets where thoughts moved more freely than they ever had before. One evening in Sweden, while staying at a modest lodge near the mountains, he picked up a book that would quietly alter the course of his life, a text discussing early mystical traditions, written in a tone that blended calm logic with a sense of wonder. It introduced the idea that behind everyday reality lay deeper structures, and that those structures could be approached through study, meditation, and symbolic understanding. The language was gentle, never dramatic, and that gentleness allowed the ideas to sink into him with unusual clarity. For the first time, he felt that the vague questions he'd carried since childhood might have a place to unfold. The book led him to seek out other writings, and soon he found himself immersed in a world of symbolism, ritual, and philosophical exploration that felt surprisingly steady rather than chaotic. He appreciated not the mystery of these traditions, but their order, the idea that the inner self could be approached methodically, with patience and intention. This sense of structure resonated with the discipline he had learned from mountaineering, where each ascent required calm focus and steady effort. The more he explored, the more he felt something inside him gently align, as though he had finally discovered a map that matched the landscape of his inner questions. Around this time, he returned briefly to England, staying in quiet guest houses while continuing his studies. London, with its mixture of fog, cobblestone streets, and hidden corners, offered the perfect backdrop for quiet reflection. He spent long afternoons in bookstores, carefully examining texts on early mystical groups and philosophical movements, drawn more to their depth than to their secrecy. What interested him most was the emphasis on self-knowledge, the idea that understanding oneself could illuminate the way one moves through the world. It was also in London that he began hearing about people who belonged to structured societies, dedicated to exploring these ideas together. Their approach was patient, emphasizing learning, discipline, and symbolic understanding rather than dramatic claims. The thought of joining such a group lingered in his mind, not as a bold ambition but as a gentle possibility, something he might explore when he felt ready. For now, he preferred to move slowly, allowing the ideas he was studying to settle fully before taking any new step. He filled entire notebooks with reflections on the nature of consciousness, the role of belief, and the subtle ways the mind reacts to the unknown. Writing became a quiet companion to him, offering a way to organize his thoughts and measure his slow internal growth. Looking back on this period, one can sense that the foundation of his future path was forming almost invisibly, built not from impulsive decisions but from a calm accumulation of insight. These were still the early days of his journey, and though he had not yet stepped into the identity that would later define him, the gentle pull toward a deeper world was becoming unmistakable. He was no longer wandering aimlessly. He was drifting steadily toward something that felt both familiar and entirely new. Guided by the quiet certainty that his life was meant to unfold in a direction few around him would fully understand. As Aleister moved into the next quiet phase of his early adulthood, the gentle pull toward structured mystical study began to take on a clearer, more tangible shape, though still without urgency or dramatic leaps, as if each step forward was part of a slow and natural unfolding. He had returned to England with the intention of continuing his private explorations, but London's calm libraries, dim reading rooms, and long-shadowed streets seemed to encourage a deeper kind of focus than he had ever known. He spent hours each day reading through texts that discuss symbolism, meditation, and the disciplined study of the inner self, always drawn toward ideas that emphasized patience rather than spectacle. Even the environment around him seemed to support this mood. Quiet fog rolled in during the evenings, softening the outlines of the city and creating a sense of stillness that invited reflection. During this time, he also began meeting individuals who approached spirituality not as a dramatic escape from ordinary life, but as a gentle, methodical inquiry into the nature of existence. Their conversations were thoughtful and slow, unfolding like long walks through a familiar landscape, where new details appeared the more one looked. These individuals emphasized that understanding oneself required steadiness, consistency, and a willingness to observe the mind without rushing toward conclusions. This calm, structured approach appealed to Aleister in a way few things had before, reminding him of the quiet discipline of mountaineering, where progress came not from ambition, but from steady, patient movement. One evening he attended a small gathering where a speaker discussed the importance of symbolic language in understanding inner experience. The ideas were presented with such clarity and calmness that Aleister found himself deeply absorbed, not because the subject was mysterious, but because it offered a framework for exploring questions he had been carrying for years. He listened intently, feeling that these concepts resonated with a part of him he had never been able to articulate. After the talk, he spent a quiet walk home considering how different his life felt now compared to the rigid world of his childhood. There was a sense of expansion, not outward but inward, as though his thoughts were slowly stretching into spaces he had not known existed. He continued to write daily, filling pages with reflections about the nature of discipline, the role of imagination, and the subtle ways in which belief shapes perception. His writing was not wild or chaotic. Instead, it carried the same gentle curiosity that had guided him since his earliest questions as a child. It was during these peaceful months that he first heard about a formal organisation dedicated to the structured study of mystical traditions. The mention came casually, in a quiet conversation at a bookshop, but something about it lingered with him long after the discussion ended. He didn't rush toward the idea. Instead, he allowed it to sit in the back of his mind, returning to it during his longer walks or while reading late into the night. The thought of joining a group was both intriguing and soothing, a possibility that felt like the next natural step rather than a sudden change. Still, Aleister preferred to move slowly, trusting that the right moment would present itself in its own time. For now, he remained content in his quiet routine, sensing that he was approaching the threshold of a new chapter, one shaped not by rebellion, but by a steady desire to understand the deeper structures of life. And as the days drifted by with their soft rhythms and reflective hours, he felt that he was, little by little, drawing closer to the path that would eventually define him, even if he had not yet stepped fully onto it. In the months that followed, Aleister continued living in a quiet rhythm that allowed his thoughts to deepen naturally, as if each day added one more soft layer to the inner landscape he'd been exploring for years, though outwardly his life seemed simple. Long walks, quiet evenings with books, and gentle conversations with a small circle of like-minded individuals. Inside, he felt a gradual shift toward greater clarity. London, with its muted colours and calm corners, seemed to encourage this sense of inward focus. He often spent mornings in small libraries or second-hand bookshops, tracing his fingers along worn spines before selecting a text that spoke to something unspoken within him. His reading now leaned more heavily towards structured mystical traditions, and the patterns he discovered in those writings began to form a subtle foundation beneath his growing understanding. These ideas were not about spectacle or dramatic revelation. They were about discipline, awareness, and the belief that the mind contained depths accessible only through patience. He found this deeply comforting. In these same weeks, he met a few individuals who were already studying within formal esoteric groups, though they spoke about their practices with a calm restraint rather than secrecy. They described their work not as magic in the dramatic sense, but as a method of training, of learning to observe the mind, understand symbolic systems, and approach life with intention. One of them, an older man with a gentle voice, explained that the purpose was not to escape the world, but to understand it more fully, beginning with oneself. This idea resonated with Aleister in a way he had rarely experienced. It reminded him of standing on a mountainside, breathing slowly, aware of every sound and shift of wind, completely present yet also connected to something larger. As the weeks passed, he found himself returning to these conversations in his thoughts, examining them from different angles, sensing that they pointed toward a path he'd been approaching for a long time. Still, he didn't rush. He continued writing in his notebooks, capturing quiet reflections on how beliefs shape perception and how symbols provide a language for understanding inner experiences. His entries became more focused, more orderly, as though he were preparing himself for a new stage without consciously planning it. One evening, while reading in his small rented room, he realized that the idea of joining a structured group no longer felt like an abstract curiosity, but a natural next step. The thought didn't bring excitement or fear, only a gentle sense of alignment, like pieces settling into place. He understood that such a step would require commitment and discipline, but those qualities no longer felt foreign to him. Instead, they felt like an extension of the quiet, steady work he had already been doing on his own. And so, without ceremony or dramatic decision, he allowed himself to consider that the moment might be approaching when he would seek out the people who had dedicated their lives to the study that had quietly shaped his own. He didn't yet know what that path would look like or how deeply it would influence his future, but he sensed he was nearing a threshold, one he would cross not out of rebellion, but out of a calm desire to understand more of what life might reveal to those willing to look inward with patience and sincerity. As Aleister drifted further into this quiet period of reflection, The presence of a more defined path continued to grow in the background of his thoughts, not loudly but steadily, like a soft hum just beneath everyday sounds. The people he had met who were involved in structured mystical study had made a stronger impression on him than he first realized. Their calm discipline, their thoughtful way of approaching ideas, and their sense of purpose stayed with him during his solitary walks through London's dimly lit streets. He found himself replaying their conversations in his mind, noticing how their words connected to themes he'd been exploring privately for years. There was something grounding in the way they described their work, precise, focused, and free of unnecessary drama. It felt aligned with the quiet structure he had always appreciated in mountaineering and in long hours of study. As he moved through his days, the idea of joining such a group began to feel less like a possibility and more like an invitation. Still, he approached the thought with the same gentleness that marked all his decisions. He didn't want to rush or force anything, knowing that clarity came slowly, like mist lifting from a landscape. In the meantime, he continued to read deeply, searching not for answers but for patterns. He spent afternoons studying symbolic systems that had survived for centuries, fascinated by how their careful structures seemed to mirror the organization of thoughts and emotions within the human mind. He filled page after page of his notebooks with reflections on how people find meaning in the world, how inner discipline shapes outer life, and how the imagination can serve as both a guide and a mirror. Writing became a soothing ritual, one that allowed him to process new ideas at a pace that felt natural. During one of his frequent visits to a small bookshop tucked away on a narrow London street, he happened upon a text that discussed the history and purpose of a well-known mystical order. The tone of the book was calm and methodical, much like the people he had met, and it described the group as a place where students could learn through structured study under experienced guidance. What struck him most was the emphasis on personal responsibility, an idea that resonated deeply with his growing understanding of discipline. That evening, as he walked home with the book under his arm, he felt a quiet sense of certainty begin to form. The world around him seemed unusually still, as if giving him space to recognize something he had been slowly approaching for years. He realized that he no longer felt satisfied staying on the outside of this world of study and symbolism. He wanted to step into it fully, not as an escape but as a continuation of the inner journey he had already begun. Over the next few days, he allowed this realization to settle, checking in with himself the way he might before beginning a long climb, and with each moment of reflection, the sense of alignment grew stronger. He felt prepared, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, grounded sense that he was ready to learn, ready to follow a path that demanded focus and sincerity. And so, with calm intention, he began making discreet inquiries about how one might join the organization he had read so much about. He didn't know exactly what the next steps would involve, but he sensed that the quiet foundation he had spent years building was now guiding him toward the threshold of a new chapter, one he would enter with the same patient curiosity that had shaped his journey from the very beginning. As Aleister began making his quiet inquiries, he felt a calm sense of purpose guiding his steps, as if the direction he had been drifting toward for years was finally taking a clear and gentle shape. The people he approached spoke with the same measured tone he had come to admire, offering guidance that was neither secretive nor dramatic, simply practical, patient, and rooted in long-standing tradition. They explained that joining their organization required not only interest but commitment, steady study, disciplined reflection, and a willingness to approach the inner world with sincerity rather than ambition. These expectations did not intimidate him. Instead, they brought a feeling of reassurance. He appreciated the structure, the quiet seriousness, and the emphasis on personal responsibility. It reminded him again of the slow, focused work of climbing a mountain, each step deliberate, each movement part of a larger journey. After several weeks of gentle back and forth, he was invited to visit a small meeting space used by members of the order. The building was unremarkable from the outside, tucked between two taller structures on a narrow London street, but inside it carried an atmosphere of calm order. The lighting was soft, the space simple, and the people he met there welcomed him with a quiet warmth. There was no attempt to impress him or overwhelm him. Instead, they offered clear explanations about their practices, their study structure, and the symbolic framework that guided their work. Aleister listened carefully, absorbing their words the way one absorbs the quiet rhythm of a steady breeze. Over the next few visits, he observed how members treated their work with respect and patience, never rushing, never chasing spectacle. Their approach appealed to him deeply. It reflected everything he had been searching for: discipline, structure, and a methodical way of exploring the questions he had carried for so long. He felt a sense of alignment building within him, not sudden but steady, like the slow turning of a compass needle finally pointing north. Eventually they invited him to apply for formal membership, explaining that the process would involve study, reflection, and an initial ceremony designed to mark the beginning of his commitment. Aleister spent several days considering this invitation, though his decision was already quietly made. He walked through London's evening streets, thinking about the path that had brought him here. Years of questioning, wandering, reading, and slowly piecing together a sense of inner direction. The more he reflected, the more he realized that this step felt not like a departure from who he was, but a natural continuation. When he finally accepted, he felt no rush of excitement, only a deep sense of calm. It was as though the quiet work he'd been doing within himself had finally found a home, a place where it could deepen with guidance and structure. He prepared for the coming ceremony with the same steady focus he used before a climb, knowing that the real work would come not from dramatic moments, but from the patient discipline that followed. And as the date approached, he sensed that his life was gently shifting into a new phase, one shaped not by rebellion or defiance, but by a sincere desire to understand the deeper patterns that had always seemed to call to him from just beyond the edges of ordinary experience. The day of Aleister's initiation arrived with a calmness that matched the quiet rhythm of the path he'd been following. He approached the small meeting place just after dusk, the soft glow of London street lamps reflecting faintly off the damp cobblestones. There was nothing grand or theatrical about the setting. If anything, its simplicity reassured him. He had never been drawn to spectacle, and the understated atmosphere felt aligned with everything he'd come to appreciate about this group. When he entered, the members greeted him with the same composed warmth they had shown from the beginning. They explained once more that the purpose of the ceremony was not to impress or overwhelm, but to mark the start of a disciplined journey, a symbolic threshold rather than an end point. Their words were spoken gently, with clarity and sincerity, and as Aleister listened, he felt himself relax into the moment, aware of the quiet steadiness in his own thoughts. The ceremony itself unfolded in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It involved symbolic gestures, simple movements, and a series of thoughtful reflections meant to remind the initiate of the responsibilities that came with deeper study. Everything was paced with intention, designed not to excite the imagination but to center the mind, encouraging a sense of presence and focus. Aleister followed each instruction with calm attention, absorbing the meaning beneath the surface of the actions. When the ceremony concluded, the members welcomed him formally, offering him access to the group's teachings, guidance, and structured study materials. There was no declaration of dramatic transformation, no sudden shift in identity, only a gentle acknowledgement that he had stepped onto a path requiring patience, discipline, and steady effort. In the days that followed, he found himself returning often to the small room where the group met. They provided him with texts to study, works that explored symbolic systems, inner reflection, and the gradual refinement of one's understanding. The material was dense but not overwhelming, and Aleister approached it with the same methodical curiosity that had characterized his reading for years. Each page offered new insights, not because the content was mysterious, but because it encouraged him to look inward with fresh perspective. He kept detailed notes, filling entire pages with observations about symbolism, the nature of intention, and the subtle ways the mind reacts to focused discipline. These early weeks felt peaceful, almost meditative. He appreciated the structure this new phase brought into his life. Regular study sessions, quiet meetings with mentors, and long walks afterward where he could process everything he had learned. What surprised him most was how grounded he felt. Instead of drifting from one idea to another, he now had a framework, a stable foundation for exploring the questions that had followed him since childhood, and although he was still at the very beginning of his journey within the Order, he sensed that he had entered a chapter that would shape his life in ways he could not yet fully understand. There was no urgency in his steps, only a calm trust that he had found a place where his curiosity and discipline could grow side by side, guiding him deeper into the landscape he had been quietly approaching for so many years. As the weeks of his early study unfolded, Aleister settled into a calm, steady routine that suited him in ways he had not anticipated. The structured teachings of the Order provided a sense of stability that balanced his lifelong curiosity, giving him both direction and space to explore ideas at a comfortable pace. Each lesson felt like a quiet step forward, not into something strange or overwhelming, but into a clearer understanding of how symbols, discipline, and focused intention could help a person observe the deeper layers of their own mind. He spent long evenings reading in his small room, the dim light of a single lamp casting soft shadows on the pages as he studied diagrams, meditations, and reflections passed down through generations. The more he read, the more he appreciated the organization's approach, slow, patient, and respectful of the time it takes for true understanding to form. During weekly meetings, he listened as senior members spoke about the importance of balance, balancing intuition with reason, imagination with discipline, and personal insight with grounded study. Their voices carried a calm steadiness, and Aleister found himself absorbing not just their words but the tone behind them, a tone that reflected years of quiet dedication. Over time, he began to notice subtle shifts within himself. His thoughts felt more organized, his emotions steadier, and his sense of purpose clearer. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but a gradual settling, the way a body of water becomes still after being stirred. The practices he learned encouraged him to observe his reactions, question his assumptions, and approach his inner life with gentleness rather than judgment. He wrote daily, filling the pages of his notebooks with reflections on the symbolic connections that appeared in his studies. What surprised him was how naturally these ideas fit into the patterns of his mind. It felt less like adopting something new, and more like recognizing a language he had been trying to speak for years. Outside his studies, he continued walking the quiet London streets, letting the rhythm of the city guide his thoughts. The fog-dimmed lamps, the muted sounds of evening, and the calm flow of pedestrians seemed to create an environment perfectly suited for contemplation. Sometimes he would pause on a bridge overlooking the river, watching the slow movement of water beneath him, as he considered how the structure of the teachings mirrored the structure of life itself, layers upon layers, each connected yet distinct. His interactions with fellow members deepened as well. They shared insights casually over tea or during unhurried conversations after meetings. Though the Order valued privacy, it did not isolate its members. Instead, it fostered a quiet sense of community based on shared discipline. These exchanges reassured Aleister that he had joined not an escape from the world, but a space where thoughtful people gathered to understand it more deeply. As he progressed through the early stages of study, he began to feel the gentle beginnings of confidence, an inner steadiness born not from certainty, but from the understanding that he was finally on a path that made sense to him. The questions that had followed him from childhood had not disappeared, but now they existed within a structure that allowed him to explore them thoughtfully. And as the days passed, Aleister sensed that this chapter of his life was only the beginning. He was moving slowly, yes, but deliberately, guided by a quiet intuition that told him he had found a foundation he could build upon, one patient step at a time. As Aleister's early studies deepened, he found himself entering a steady rhythm of learning that brought a calm sense of continuity to his days. The Order's structured lessons progressed at a measured pace, offering new material only when the previous concepts had settled enough to become part of one's thinking. He appreciated this slow unfolding. It allowed him to absorb each idea fully, without the pressure to rush or reach conclusions too quickly. Many evenings were spent in thoughtful silence, reviewing the symbols and diagrams that formed the foundation of his training. These symbols were not presented as supernatural objects, but as tools, ways of mapping the inner landscape, much like a mountaineer studies maps before approaching unfamiliar terrain. Aleister often reflected on this parallel. He realized that just as climbing required patience, focus, and awareness of every step, so too did this inward journey. There was something grounding in that comparison, something that reminded him that true understanding comes from steady effort rather than sudden inspiration. During weekly gatherings, senior members guided small groups through discussions and simple exercises designed to cultivate concentration. These meetings were gentle in tone, free of drama or intensity, and Aleister found comfort in their predictability. Each session felt like a quiet checkpoint along his path, a place to gather insight and adjust course where needed. Over time, he grew more engaged in these discussions, offering his own observations with increasing clarity. The members welcomed his thoughts, appreciating his careful way of expressing ideas. Though he was still a newcomer, he felt a quiet sense of belonging forming around him. His relationships within the Order grew slowly but naturally. Some evenings he stayed after meetings, sharing calm conversations with fellow students who, like him, had come seeking a deeper understanding of themselves. They spoke about the balance between everyday life and inward study, and Aleister was reassured to find that many of them led lives that appeared ordinary from the outside. Their dedication was expressed through consistency rather than dramatic change, and this perspective helped him maintain his own balance. Outside of the Order, his routine remained simple. He continued to walk through the quiet streets of London, often taking long routes home after meetings. These walks became spaces where he processed what he had learned, letting the cool night air help organize his thoughts. He sometimes paused near the river, watching the gentle movement of the water as he reflected on how his understanding of discipline was shifting. It no longer felt like something imposed upon him from outside as it had in his childhood. Instead, it felt like something he was choosing, something that offered structure, clarity, and a sense of inner steadiness. As the months passed, Aleister sensed that he was slowly approaching a new level of study, one that would ask more of him while offering deeper insight in return. Yet he felt no urgency. His progress felt natural, like the slow changing of seasons. And though he did not yet know where this path would lead, he moved forward with the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, learning at a pace that allowed each new idea to take root without strain or confusion. As Aleister continued his steady progression through the early grades of study, he began to notice how the teachings of the Order were subtly reshaping the way he approached everyday life. Nothing about his outward behaviour changed dramatically. He still walked the same quiet streets, visited the same bookstores, and kept to the same gentle routines. But internally, his thoughts were becoming more organised, more deliberate, and more attuned to the connections between ideas, emotions, and intention. The exercises assigned to him at this stage were simple, yet they required a kind of consistency he had rarely practiced before. Some focused on observing the patterns of his own mind, noting how thoughts arose and faded without being forced. Others encouraged him to reflect on how symbols he studied appeared not only in diagrams and texts, but in the world around him, in architecture, in literature, even in the subtle rhythm of everyday conversations. He found these connections calming rather than mysterious, like discovering that a melody he had always liked had harmonies he'd never fully heard until now. During weekly meetings, the discussions grew a little deeper. Senior members introduced new concepts with the same calm clarity that had first drawn him to the Order. always emphasizing steady practice over dramatic interpretation. They encouraged students to ask questions, but also to sit with uncertainty when answers didn't come immediately. Aleister appreciated this approach. It reminded him of long climbs in the mountains, where patience often mattered more than strength. He found himself developing a new kind of discipline, not the rigid external discipline of his childhood, but an internal one, grounded in understanding rather than fear. His notebooks grew thicker as he filled them with reflections, sketches of symbolic patterns, and gentle insights that came to him during moments of quiet. Sometimes, while writing, he realized that he was beginning to sense subtle shifts in his perception. Not supernatural changes, but a growing awareness of how his mind reacted to different experiences. This awareness brought him a sense of calm and stability that felt profoundly different from anything he had known in his earlier years. His relationships within the order deepened as well. Though the group valued privacy and independence, there was an unspoken sense of community among those who studied together. Aleister found comfort in these quiet connections. Conversations after meetings often drifted into thoughtful reflections about balancing inner work with the demands of daily life. He was struck by how ordinary many of the members seemed, teachers, clerks, writers, yet how sincerely they approached their studies. This helped him maintain perspective, reminding him that progress was not measured by dramatic change, but by steady inner refinement. Outside the order, his days remained simple. He continued his long evening walks, where the soft glow of London's lamps reflected on the pavement, creating patterns of light that seemed to mirror the symbols he studied. These walks became one of his favourite parts of the day, moments when he could let new ideas settle without forcing them. As the months passed, he sensed that he was nearing another quiet threshold in his training. His mentors hinted that soon he would be introduced to more advanced material, not in a sudden leap, but in another gradual shift, just as every stage before had unfolded. Aleister felt prepared for this. His curiosity had matured into something steadier, and his discipline felt less like an effort and more like a natural part of his days. And though he knew the path ahead would require patience and dedication, he felt a gentle confidence forming within him, the sense that his life was slowly aligning with a purpose he had been moving toward long before he ever had the words to describe it. As Aleister approached the next stage of his studies, he sensed a gentle shift in the rhythm of his learning, as though the path ahead were widening in a way that invited him to step forward with calm intention. His mentors introduced him to new material gradually, offering concepts that were more intricate but still rooted in the same steady principles he'd grown accustomed to. These teachings focused on the deeper layers of symbolic interpretation and the subtle ways that intention influences perception. They were not presented as secrets, but as tools, practical methods for understanding the inner patterns that shaped thought and emotion. Aleister approached this material with quiet diligence, spending long evenings reading by the dim glow of his lamp, letting each idea settle before moving on to the next. He found that his ability to concentrate had strengthened over the months, and he now moved through the lessons with a steady focus that felt almost meditative. His notebooks filled with more detailed reflections, and he began to trace connections between earlier lessons and the new concepts being introduced. This sense of continuity reassured him. It reminded him that growth, whether inward or outward, happened gradually, layer by layer. During group discussions, he noticed that he was becoming more comfortable speaking about his observations. His thoughts flowed with greater clarity, shaped by the discipline he'd cultivated through repeated practice. His fellow students responded thoughtfully, and their calm exchanges often lingered in his mind during his walks home. These conversations strengthened his sense of belonging, even though the order encouraged independence. The sense of quiet community helped him maintain balance, reminding him that the inner journey was shared, even if each person travelled it in their own way. Outside the order, his life continued in its familiar rhythms. London's soft twilight, the gentle hum of the streets, and the reflective moments he found along the river remained steady parts of his days. Yet he noticed that he experienced these simple scenes differently now, with a deeper sense of presence. The teachings had subtly sharpened his awareness, allowing him to see patterns and meanings in moments that once felt ordinary. He realized that this was part of the process, learning not to escape life, but to perceive it more clearly. As months passed, his mentors told him he would soon begin a new phase of work, one that would require even more consistency and a deeper level of self-observation. They explained this without urgency, emphasizing that readiness was measured not by time but by steadiness of mind. Aleister felt prepared, not because he believed he had mastered anything, but because the path had unfolded so naturally that the next step felt like an extension of the one before it. There was no dramatic anticipation, only a calm acknowledgement that he was continuing forward. And though he could not see exactly where this journey would lead, he trusted the gradual rhythm that had guided him so far, sensing that each quiet lesson was shaping him in ways that were both subtle and lasting. As Aleister entered this next phase of his studies, he began to notice that the work required a different kind of patience, one that asked him not only to learn new material but to observe how each idea quietly influenced the way he moved through his days. His mentors introduced him to practices focused on sustained attention and the gentle discipline of self-reflection. These exercises were simple on the surface, yet they revealed subtle details about how thoughts arose, how emotions shifted, and how easily the mind drifted when not anchored by intention. Aleister approached each task with calm dedication, recognizing that the value of the work lay in its consistency rather than complexity. Even on days when his focus felt scattered, he reminded himself that progress often came through returning to the practice again and again, much like retracing a familiar climbing path until the movements became second nature. In group meetings, he noticed that discussions now revolved more around personal insight and the steady refinement of perception. Students spoke gently about their experiences, sharing how certain exercises had revealed patterns in their thinking or emotion they had never considered before. Aleister listened attentively, appreciating the sincerity of their reflections. He found comfort in the realization that everyone, regardless of background or age, encountered similar challenges. This sense of shared effort helped him maintain perspective, reminding him that the inward path was not about perfection, but about awareness. Outside the order, his life remained calm and grounded. He continued walking through London's quiet streets, often taking long routes home after meetings to give his mind space to process the day's lessons. The soft glow of the street lamps, the muted colours of the buildings, and the familiar hum of the city created an atmosphere that felt almost meditative. These walks became an extension of his practice, offering moments of stillness where insights could surface naturally. His notebooks reflected this deepening process. The entries became more introspective, filled with observations about the small shifts in his thoughts and reactions throughout the day. He noted how certain moments of clarity emerged unexpectedly, often when he was engaged in something simple, sitting by the river, reading a quiet passage, or observing the gentle rhythm of people passing by. These subtle changes gave him a sense of progress that felt grounded and unforced. After several months, his mentors informed him that he would soon begin working with more advanced material. They emphasized that this was not a test or a threshold in the dramatic sense, but simply the next step in a gradual unfolding. They reminded him that the pace of study was guided not by ambition, but by readiness, a readiness measured by steadiness, curiosity, and the ability to remain present with the work. Aleister felt a quiet sense of alignment at this news. He didn't feel excitement or anxiety, only a gentle recognition that he had reached this point naturally. The study had become part of his daily rhythm, shaping the way he thought and observed the world. He understood that the journey ahead would continue to require patience and sincerity, but these qualities now felt like familiar companions. And as he looked ahead to the coming phase, he sensed that each new lesson would not pull him away from himself, but guide him more deeply into the quiet terrain he'd been exploring since the earliest days of his curiosity. As Aleister stepped into the next phase of his studies, he found the teachings becoming more layered, inviting him to approach familiar ideas from new angles while maintaining the calm steadiness that had guided him so far. His mentors introduced him to practices designed to strengthen inner clarity, exercises that required not only thought, but a quiet awareness of how his mind moved from one idea to another. These lessons emphasize subtlety, recognizing the faint shifts in focus, the small habits of attention, and the gentle patterns that shaped his perception without his noticing. Aleister approached this work with patience, understanding now that progress in the Order was rarely dramatic. Instead, it unfolded like the slow brightening of dawn, each moment adding just a little more light to what he already knew. Even on days when the exercises felt challenging, he reminded himself that the purpose was not mastery but awareness, a steady willingness to observe himself with honesty and calmness. During meetings, his mentors spoke more often about balance, the importance of maintaining simplicity in daily life while exploring deeper layers of study. They encouraged students to see learning as a continuous rhythm, one that flowed into every aspect of living rather than remaining confined to designated practice sessions. Aleister found this perspective grounding. He began to notice how small choices during the day affected his concentration during evening exercises, and how moments of quiet reflection helped him approach each lesson with a clearer mind. Outside the Order, life continued with its familiar rhythm, though he sensed a growing unity between his inner work and the world around him. His walks through London took on a new softness. He moved more slowly, more attentively, letting the gentle details of the city settle into his awareness. The muted colours of the buildings, the steady flow of people, and the calm movement of the river all seemed to reflect the quiet structure he was developing within himself. These walks often became extensions of his training, moments where thoughts arranged themselves naturally without effort. His notebooks filled with reflections that were clearer than before. He wrote about how intention shaped perception, how discipline grew from consistency, and how even simple acts, pausing before speaking, observing before reacting, revealed layers of understanding he had never noticed. The writing process became almost meditative, a way of tracing the slow unfolding of his inner journey. As time passed, his mentors noted his steadiness and informed him that he would soon encounter material that required deeper introspection. They spoke of it gently, emphasizing that this stage was not about complexity, but about refinement, learning to approach each idea with patience, humility, and the calm confidence he had cultivated over months of practice. Aleister received this guidance with a sense of quiet readiness. The work no longer felt like something separate from his life, but part of a continuous flow that touched every moment of his day. He understood that the coming lessons would encourage him to look even more carefully at himself, not for flaws or strengths, but simply for truth. And as he looked toward this new phase, he felt a steady assurance that he was prepared, not through ambition or excitement, but through the gentle discipline that had become the foundation of his unfolding path. As Aleister entered this deeper stage of study, he noticed that the teaching shifted subtly from intellectual understanding to a quieter, more internal form of observation. His mentors now encouraged him to slow down even further, to pay attention not just to the ideas presented, but to the spaces between them, the pauses, the transitions, the gentle currents of thought that shaped his responses. These exercises were simple in appearance, yet they required a calm steadiness that he had only recently begun to cultivate. Instead of focusing on new material, much of his work centered on revisiting earlier concepts with a clearer mind, allowing their meaning to unfold gradually rather than trying to grasp everything at once. This approach brought him a sense of ease. He realized that learning at this level depended less on gathering information and more on allowing understanding to deepen naturally, like water settling into stillness. During meetings, his mentors spoke in soft, measured tones about the importance of patience, reminding students that insight often emerged slowly, sometimes only after the mind had been allowed to rest. Aleister found these discussions soothing. They aligned with his own growing recognition that inner clarity could not be forced. Instead, it came when the mind was calm, receptive, and free of urgency. The Order's emphasis on balance became more meaningful to him during this time. He noticed how moments of quiet in his daily life supported the more focused work of study, and how the gentle discipline of the practices helped him move through everyday situations with greater ease. Even simple tasks, reading, preparing tea, walking through the evening fog, took on a reflective quality, as if each action held space for insight. His walks through London became especially important. The soft glow of streetlights on damp pavement, the distant murmur of voices, and the steady rhythm of passing carriages created an atmosphere that felt almost meditative. These quiet evenings gave him time to process what he had learned, letting thoughts drift into place without pressure. Sometimes he paused along the river, watching the slow movement of the water as he reflected on how different his life felt now compared to his earlier years. The discipline that once felt restrictive in childhood had transformed into something self-chosen and peaceful. His notebooks began to fill with observations that were more nuanced than before. Instead of writing primarily about external teachings, he now recorded the subtle shifts in his own awareness, the way he interpreted moments, how he responded to challenges, and the quiet balance that began to take shape within him. These entries showed him that growth was happening gently, often without his noticing. After several months of this steady work, his mentors informed him that he was preparing to enter a stage that required sustained introspection. They explained that he would begin focusing on practices designed to reveal the deeper patterns of thought that influenced his perception. Their tone was calm and reassuring, emphasizing that readiness came not from mastery but from consistency and sincerity. Aleister felt grounded by their words. He understood that each step he had taken in the Order had unfolded naturally, guided by curiosity rather than ambition, and as he looked ahead, he sensed that this new phase would not take him somewhere unfamiliar, but would guide him further into the quiet landscape he'd been exploring all along, one patient moment at a time. As Aleister transitioned into this new phase of introspective study, the rhythm of his days took on an even quieter, more deliberate tone. His mentors encouraged him to begin noticing the finer details of his inner experience, how thoughts formed, how emotions drifted in and out, and how subtle patterns influenced his perception without drawing attention to themselves. These exercises were not meant to provoke dramatic realizations, but to cultivate a gentle, steady form of awareness. Aleister approached them with calm commitment, understanding that the purpose of this stage was to refine his ability to observe rather than to judge. Each morning he set aside time for silent reflection, allowing his mind to settle before engaging in the symbolic and meditative practices assigned to him. During these sessions, he learned to recognize how quickly the mind could wander, and how bringing it back required patience rather than force. The process reminded him of climbing difficult terrain. Progress came not through power, but through steady intention, step after careful step. In group meetings, the discussions became more personal, though still carried out with the Order's characteristic gentleness. Students shared how certain exercises had brought subtle changes to their perception, and mentors responded with guidance that emphasized balance and humility. Aleister found these meetings deeply reassuring. They reminded him that every person, regardless of their background or presumed strength of mind, was learning to navigate the same internal landscape. The sense of quiet community strengthened his confidence, helping him remain focused even on days when the work felt abstract or elusive. Outside the Order, London continued to provide the backdrop for his unfolding journey. His evening walks remained an essential part of his routine. The dim lamplight, the soft murmur of the city, and the quiet flow of the river offered him a space to reflect without effort. Often, during these walks, the ideas he had studied earlier in the day would settle into place, forming connections that felt natural and unforced. He began to see how the inner discipline he was cultivating influenced even the smallest moments, how he listened, how he responded to others, and how he interpreted the world around him. His notebooks became more contemplative. Instead of focusing solely on the structure of teachings, he wrote about the gentle shifts occurring within himself, increased clarity, a growing sense of calm, and a deeper appreciation for the steady rhythm of the order's methods. These reflections helped him recognize that understanding often arrived not in sudden insights, but in gradual changes that accumulated quietly over time. Months into this phase, his mentors told him he was progressing steadily, and that he would soon begin exploring teachings that dealt with the symbolic nature of personal transformation. They emphasized once more that this work required patience, sincerity, and a willingness to remain steady even when understanding felt distant. Aleister received their guidance with the same quiet openness that had shaped his journey so far. He did not rush ahead or question whether he was ready. Instead, he trusted the gradual unfolding of the path, knowing that each step, no matter how small, was part of a process that had been shaping him for years. And as he prepared for the next stage, he felt a gentle assurance, not a sense of accomplishment, but a calm recognition that the journey inward was deepening in its own time, guiding him further into the quiet terrain he had long been seeking. As Aleister moved into this next stage of study, his mentors introduced teachings that focused more directly on personal transformation, though always through gradual, steady practice rather than dramatic shifts. The material encouraged him to observe how his inner patterns, habits of thought, small emotional reactions, and subtle assumptions shaped the way he perceived the world. Instead of trying to change these patterns quickly, he was asked to simply notice them, allowing the quiet awareness he had been cultivating to deepen naturally. This approach felt calm and reassuring. It reminded him that real growth did not come from force, but from consistent attention over time. During his daily exercises, he found himself becoming more attuned to the subtle rhythms of his own mind. He noticed how certain thoughts lingered without reason, how familiar emotions returned in gentle waves, and how the simple act of breathing with intention helped steady his awareness. These observations did not bring dramatic revelations, but they helped him understand himself with increasing clarity. In group meetings, students discussed the transformative potential of sustained introspection. They spoke about how inner change often appeared slowly, becoming noticeable only when looking back over weeks or months. Aleister appreciated these conversations. They reminded him that the process was meant to be lived calmly, without expectation of sudden breakthroughs. The encouragement he received from mentors and fellow students gave him a quiet sense of reassurance, helping him trust the path even when some lessons felt abstract. Outside the order, his routines became more intentional. His evening walks through London continued to serve as a gentle extension of his inner work. The city's soft lights, the muted sounds of night time, and the familiar sight of the river all provided moments for reflection. Sometimes he paused on a bridge, letting the stillness of the water mirror the slow settling of his thoughts. He found that these quiet pauses often brought a subtle sense of alignment, as though the ideas he studied inside the order were weaving themselves into the fabric of his everyday life. His notebooks reflected this deepening process. Instead of simply recording teachings, he now wrote about the small shifts he noticed within himself, greater patience, steadier focus, and a calm awareness that had begun to influence even the simplest interactions. These entries showed him that transformation was happening, not through grand moments, but through consistent practice that gradually reshaped his understanding. After several months, his mentors told him he would soon begin working with teachings that explored how intention and discipline could guide personal growth. They spoke gently, emphasizing that this stage was not a test, but a continuation of the slow unfolding that had guided him from the beginning. Aleister listened with a sense of quiet readiness. He knew that the work ahead would require sincerity and steadiness, but these qualities had already become part of his daily rhythm. And as he looked toward the next chapter of his journey, he felt a calm confidence, an understanding that he was not rushing toward change, but allowing it to unfold naturally, one careful moment at a time. As Aleister stepped into this new chapter of study, he found the teachings turning toward the quiet power of intention, how deliberate focus, applied gently and consistently, could guide a person's inner development over long stretches of time. His mentors emphasized that intention was not force or ambition, but a steady alignment of thought and action, something built through calm repetition rather than sudden effort. This perspective resonated with him. He understood now that the practices he had been learning were not isolated exercises, but parts of a larger rhythm, each reinforcing the next in subtle ways. During his daily reflections, he began to observe how even small choices affected his clarity, how beginning the day slowly helped him focus, how taking a few quiet breaths before reading softened distractions, and how approaching each lesson without expectation allowed understanding to unfold naturally. These discoveries brought him a sense of ease. Instead of pushing himself, he let his attention settle where it needed to be, trusting the process he had been following for months. In meetings, mentors spoke about the connection between intention and discipline, reminding students that both were cultivated through steady, mindful living. They encouraged the group to view each moment as part of the path, whether it involved study, work, or simple tasks. Aleister found this holistic view comforting. It helped him realize that his training was not something separate from the rest of his life, but a way of moving through the world with greater awareness. His relationships within the order continued to grow quietly. Conversations after meetings touched on the subtle changes each person noticed in themselves, a calmer approach to challenges, a clearer sense of purpose, or a newfound steadiness in thought. These gentle exchanges reminded Aleister that transformation was shared, even if each person experienced it differently. Outside the order, he moved through London with increased attentiveness. His evening walks became times of reflection, where he noticed how the city seemed to mirror the inner stillness he was cultivating. The soft glow of street lamps on wet pavement, the quiet murmur of distant conversations, and the slow movement of the river all felt like reminders of the steady flow of his own progress. He often paused near familiar spots, letting the calm atmosphere help settle the ideas he'd studied earlier. His notebooks filled with reflections that traced the development of his awareness. He wrote about how intention shaped his daily rhythm, how discipline created space for clarity, and how small insights accumulated into deeper understanding. Reading back through these entries, he saw a pattern, a gentle unfolding that had taken place almost without his noticing. After several months of steady growth, his mentors informed him that he would soon begin exploring teachings centered on integration, learning how to bring the principles of study into every part of life, not through rigid adherence but through quiet consistency. They explained this stage with the same calmness that had guided every step of his journey, reminding him that readiness came from patience and sincerity. Aleister felt prepared, not through excitement, but through a soft confidence that had grown over time. The path no longer felt like something he was trying to follow. It felt like something he was becoming part of, slowly and naturally. And as he looked ahead, he sensed that each new lesson would continue shaping him in gentle, lasting ways. As Aleister entered the stage focused on integration, he began to notice how naturally the teachings were weaving themselves into the fabric of his daily life. His mentors explained that this phase was less about learning new material and more about allowing the ideas he'd already studied to settle into every part of his routine. Integration, they said, was a quiet process, one that deepened not through effort, but through gentle awareness. Aleister found this approach reassuring. It reminded him that growth was not measured by how quickly he advanced, but by how steadily he applied what he had learned. During his morning reflections, he practiced observing how his thoughts shaped his actions throughout the day. He noticed patterns he once overlooked. How small pauses created clarity in conversation, how steady breathing helped him stay present, and how the intention he set at the start of each day guided him with a calm, consistent rhythm. These realizations gave him a sense of grounding. In meetings, mentors encouraged students to practice integration in simple ways, carrying lessons into their work, interactions, and quiet moments alone. They emphasized that true discipline was not rigid, but flexible. It adapted to life's changes while maintaining an underlying steadiness. Aleister embraced this idea. It helped him understand that the path he was following did not require retreat from the world, but a deeper engagement with it. Conversations with fellow students reflected this shift as well. They spoke about noticing subtle changes in themselves, greater patience, clearer communication, and an increased ability to move through challenges without being emotionally pulled off balance. Aleister recognized many of these shifts within himself. It reassured him to know that what he felt was part of a shared process, even though each person experienced it in their own way. Outside the order, London continued to serve as a quiet companion in his journey. His evening walks now felt different. He moved through the city with a sense of calm purpose. The soft lights, the steady flow of passers-by, and the quiet presence of the river all seemed to reflect the inner steadiness he was cultivating. He often paused by the water, letting its slow movement remind him that progress too flowed gently over time. His notebooks filled with reflections on how integration was shaping him. He wrote about the surprising ease that came from aligning intention with action, and how simple habits, consistent study, mindful breathing, thoughtful listening, created a stability he had rarely felt before. Reading his earlier entries, he could see how far he had come, not through dramatic shifts, but through countless small moments where awareness had quietly expanded. After several months, his mentors told him he was progressing well, and that he would soon begin exploring teachings that examined the relationship between personal purpose and inner discipline. They explained this transition with their usual calm tone, reminding him that each stage was simply another step in a long journey. Aleister felt ready for what lay ahead. The path no longer felt like something external he was trying to follow. It felt like an internal rhythm he had grown into over time. And as he prepared for the next phase, he did so with the same steady patience that had carried him this far, trusting that each lesson would continue unfolding with gentle clarity. As Aleister stepped into the phase that explored the connection between personal purpose and inner discipline, he found that the teachings encouraged a deeper kind of reflection, one that asked him to consider not only how he practiced, but why. His mentors spoke gently about this shift, explaining that purpose did not need to appear as a grand vision or dramatic revelation. Instead, it often emerged through quiet observation, shaped by the subtle patterns of one's thoughts, values, and daily actions. This perspective resonated with him. He understood now that discipline was not just a structure he followed, but a tool that helped him recognize what truly mattered to him. During his daily reflections, he began paying closer attention to what drew his interest naturally, noticing which ideas created a sense of calm focus and which ones faded without effort. These observations were small, but they revealed a slow-forming sense of direction within him. In meetings, mentors encouraged students to explore their purpose with patience, reminding them that clarity often arose gradually, like light spreading softly across a quiet room. They emphasized that purpose was not an external expectation, but an inner alignment, a sense of moving in harmony with one's own nature. Aleister found comfort in this. It allowed him to approach the question without pressure or urgency. Conversations with fellow students reflected a similar tone. They shared their experiences of discovering small hints of purpose in ordinary moments, while reading, while working, or while sitting in silent reflection. These exchanges reassured Aleister that he did not need to force clarity. He only needed to remain open to it. Outside the order, he continued to move through London with his familiar calm. His walks along the river became moments where thoughts surfaced gently, often revealing the quiet motivations behind his actions. He noticed that his desire for understanding had always been steady, and that the discipline he cultivated was not separate from his nature, but an extension of it. These realizations gave him a sense of direction that felt natural and unstrained. His notebooks became a place where he explored these thoughts more deeply. He wrote about how purpose might be found in the way he approached learning, in his curiosity about the inner landscape, and in the steady patience he had developed over months of practice. Each entry helped clarify the subtle connection between discipline and meaning, showing him that purpose did not appear fully formed, but gathered itself slowly through consistent reflection. After some time, his mentors noticed this growing clarity in his work. They told him he was now ready to begin studying teachings that dealt with the refinement of intention, how to align one's inner purpose with the steady practice he had been developing. They explained that this next stage would not be more difficult, only more focused, requiring the same patience and sincerity he had shown throughout his journey. Aleister felt prepared. The path ahead did not feel like a leap, but a continuation, a natural extension of everything he'd been quietly cultivating. And as he looked toward the next phase, he carried with him a growing sense of alignment, trusting that his purpose would continue to unfold with the same gentle clarity that had guided him from the beginning. As Aleister entered the stage focused on refining intention, he found that the teachings now encouraged him to work with a quieter, more precise form of awareness. His mentors explained that intention, when shaped gently and consistently, could guide a person's inner development with remarkable steadiness. It was not about striving or forcing change, but about aligning thought and action in a way that reflected one's deeper purpose. Aleister appreciated this subtle approach. It matched the calm rhythm he had been cultivating for months. Each day he practiced setting small, deliberate intentions, whether during study, reflection, or simple tasks. He noticed how even a gentle shift in mindset affected the clarity of his thoughts. These intentional moments gave him a sense of direction that felt grounded rather than ambitious. During group meetings, discussions often centered on the relationship between intention and presence. Mentors spoke with their usual calmness, reminding students that intention was most effective when paired with a quiet, focused state of mind. They encouraged everyone to observe how easily intention became scattered when the mind grew restless or distracted. Aleister found these insights helpful. They allowed him to understand his own habits more clearly, recognizing when his thoughts drifted and learning to guide them back with patience rather than frustration. Conversations with fellow students also took on a new tone. Many shared how refining their intentions helped them navigate daily challenges with greater ease. These thoughtful exchanges strengthened the sense of community within the group, offering reassurance that each student was experiencing similar stages of growth. Outside the order, Aleister continued his evening walks through London, finding that they naturally supported his work with intention. The city's gentle nighttime rhythm, soft lights, muted footsteps, the distant hum of activity, offered a calming backdrop for reflection. As he walked, he often reviewed the intentions he set earlier in the day, noticing how they had shaped his actions and responses. His notebooks became filled with observations on how intention influenced his sense of clarity. He wrote about how simple practices, when approached with sincerity, created a steady inner focus. Reading back through these entries, he could see the gradual refinement of his awareness, a quiet progression that mirrored the slow unfolding of his studies. After several months of steady work, his mentors informed him that he was nearing a point where he could begin exploring teachings related to deeper symbolic interpretation, material that would require the clarity and steadiness he had been developing. They emphasized that this next stage was not an escalation but an expansion, inviting him to apply his refined intention to more intricate layers of study. Aleister felt a calm readiness at their words. He understood that every stage had prepared him for the next. not through dramatic breakthroughs but through quiet, consistent practice. And as he looked ahead, he sensed that the upcoming phase would offer new depth to the inner landscape he had been exploring patiently, one gentle step at a time. As Aleister moved into the stage centered on deeper symbolic interpretation, he noticed that the teachings began to rely more heavily on the clarity he had spent months cultivating. His mentors explained that symbols were not meant to be solved like puzzles, but experienced with a calm, steady awareness. Each symbol held layers of meaning that revealed themselves gradually, depending on the intention and presence brought to the study. This gentle approach suited him well. He no longer felt the need to analyze everything immediately. Instead, he allowed insights to appear slowly, often during quiet moments when he was not actively seeking them. During study sessions, he spent long periods simply sitting with a single diagram or passage, letting his mind settle before engaging with the material. He discovered that when he approached a symbol without expectation, its meaning unfolded naturally, like a landscape coming into view through lifting fog. In meetings, mentors emphasized that symbolic interpretation was not about reaching definitive conclusions, but about recognizing connections between thoughts, emotions, memories, and the broader patterns of life. They reassured students that clarity would come through steady, patient reflection. Aleister found these discussions grounding. They reminded him that understanding was not something to chase, but something to allow. Conversations with fellow students reflected a similar spirit. Many described how certain symbols had taken on personal resonance over time, shaping their inner awareness in subtle ways. These exchanges helped Aleister realize that symbolic work was deeply individual, yet shared through the common language of the Order. Outside the Order, his walks through London took on new meaning. He began to notice patterns in the world around him, symmetry in architecture, recurring motifs in shop signs, and the quiet rhythm of movement along the river. These details didn't feel mystical or dramatic. They simply echoed the structural patterns he studied, offering gentle reminders that symbols existed not only in books, but in everyday life. His notebooks became filled with reflections on these connections. He wrote about the way certain shapes evoked calm, how repeated patterns appeared in both nature and human behavior, and how symbolic thinking helped him understand his own experiences more clearly. These entries showed him that symbolic interpretation was not an abstract exercise, but a way of seeing the world with greater depth. After several months of this steady work, his mentors informed him that he was preparing to enter a phase where symbolic study would be combined with more introspective practices. They explained that this integration would help strengthen his inner clarity, guiding him to connect external symbols with the quiet movements of his own mind. Their tone was calm and reassuring, emphasizing that he had already built the foundation needed for this next step. Aleister felt ready. The work no longer felt like a series of separate stages, but a single unfolding journey, each lesson building gently on the last. And as he prepared for the next phase, he carried with him a growing sense of ease, trusting that the path would continue to reveal itself with the same quiet steadiness that had guided him from the beginning. As Aleister entered the phase where symbolic study merged with introspection, he found that the teachings encouraged him to bring his focus inward with even greater gentleness. His mentors explained that this stage was meant to deepen the connection between the symbols he studied and the quiet movements of his own thoughts and emotions. Rather than treating symbols as external objects, he was invited to notice how they resonated within him, how certain shapes, patterns, or ideas stirred subtle reactions that revealed something about his inner landscape. This approach felt natural to him. Over time, he had learned to observe himself with calm steadiness, and now he applied that awareness to each symbol he encountered. During study sessions, he spent more time in silence, letting images and concepts settle gently before exploring their meaning. He found that insights often arose not through analysis, but through quiet recognition, small realizations that emerged when the mind was still. In meetings, mentors emphasized that introspective symbolic work required patience and balance. They reminded students that each symbol acted like a mirror, reflecting different aspects of the mind depending on the clarity one brought to the practice. Their guidance was soft, reassuring students that this stage was not meant to produce dramatic revelations, but to cultivate deeper self-understanding. Aleister appreciated this, as it allowed him to explore without pressure. Conversations with fellow students also became more reflective. Many shared how certain symbols had revealed unexpected connections between their thoughts, memories, and daily experiences. These exchanges helped him feel supported, reminding him that the inner journey, though personal, was part of a shared process within the order. Outside the order, his walks through London felt more contemplative than ever. He noticed how the world around him seemed to echo the symbolic work he was doing. The repetition of shapes in bridges and buildings, the rhythm of footsteps on quiet streets, and the flow of the river that seemed to mirror the gentle movement of his thoughts. These observations didn't feel extraordinary. They simply brought a sense of alignment, as if the inner and outer worlds were gradually becoming more connected. His notebooks filled with reflections on these experiences. He wrote about how certain symbols seemed to guide his attention inward, how moments of clarity emerged during stillness, and how the work helped him understand the subtle patterns that shaped his reactions. Reading these entries, he could see how his awareness had deepened over time, becoming more grounded and perceptive. After months of steady progress, his mentors told him that he was approaching a stage where introspective work would be paired with more structured practices, designed to help students develop greater stability and focus. They explained this transition calmly, assuring him that the next phase would simply build on the clarity he had already cultivated. Aleister felt prepared. This new chapter did not feel like a leap, but a continuation, a gentle broadening of the path he had been walking with patience and sincerity. And as he looked ahead, he trusted that each step would unfold naturally, just as it always had. As Aleister moved into the phase where introspective work blended with more structured practices, he found that the teachings now encouraged a balance between inward observation and steady outward discipline. His mentors explained that this stage was meant to strengthen the clarity he'd developed, helping him ground his insights through consistent, practical methods. These practices were simple but precise, designed to bring calm focus to the mind while offering a stable framework for deeper reflection. Aleister approached them with quiet dedication. Each morning he spent time in deliberate stillness, using the techniques he'd been taught to settle his thoughts before beginning the day. He noticed that this grounding routine helped him carry a sense of steadiness into everything he did: study, conversation, and even ordinary tasks. The structured practices did not feel burdensome. Instead, they added a gentle rhythm to his days, reinforcing the calm awareness he had cultivated over months of introspection. In meetings, mentors emphasized that this stage was not about achieving perfection, but about learning to sustain clarity through regular, balanced effort. They encouraged students to observe how their minds responded to structured routines, how focus sharpened when practiced consistently, and how awareness deepened when given a stable foundation. Aleister found these discussions helpful. They reminded him that growth was a gradual process, shaped by patience rather than intensity. Conversations with fellow students reflected this sense of steady development. Many spoke about feeling more grounded as they integrated structured practices into their daily lives. These shared experiences reassured Aleister that he was moving at the right pace, allowing each step to unfold naturally. Outside the order, his walks through London continued to support his inner work. He moved through the city with a quiet attentiveness, noticing how the steady rhythm of his footsteps helped settle his thoughts. The soft glow of the lamps, the calm flow of the river, and the muted sounds of the streets all contributed to a sense of centeredness. These peaceful walks often became the moments when insights surfaced naturally, as if the gentle motion helped bring clarity to the ideas he studied. His notebooks reflected this growing stability. He wrote about the way structured practice supported introspection, how routine brought a calm sense of continuity, and how inner awareness became more consistent when grounded in simple daily habits. These reflections showed him that his understanding was deepening not through sudden realizations, but through steady, dependable practice. After some time, his mentors informed him that he was approaching a stage where the structured discipline he had developed would prepare him for more advanced aspects of the order's teachings. They explained that this next phase would introduce new layers of study, but that he already possessed the patience and steadiness needed to approach them. Their reassurance felt grounding, reminding him that each step of the path had prepared him for the next. Aleister felt ready. The work ahead did not feel daunting, but simply like the natural continuation of everything he'd been building. Clarity, discipline, and a sense of calm presence. And as he looked toward the next chapter, he did so with quiet confidence, trusting the steady unfolding of the journey he had embraced so sincerely. As Aleister stepped toward the next phase of study, he sensed a gentle shift in the tone of his work. His mentors explained that he was now ready to engage with material that required both the introspective depth he had cultivated and the steady discipline he had practiced. This stage was described as an expansion rather than a challenge, an opportunity to explore broader patterns of thought while remaining anchored in the clarity he had built over time. The new teachings introduced concepts that were more layered, yet still approached with the same quiet, methodical pace that characterized the order. Aleister found comfort in this familiarity. He understood now that even complex ideas could unfold smoothly when met with patience and presence. His daily routines remained simple: morning stillness, steady study sessions, and quiet reflection in the evenings. These habits provided the stability he needed to move through the more intricate material. In meetings, mentors emphasized that advanced study was not about grasping more, but about seeing more clearly. They encouraged students to approach dense material with calm observation, allowing insights to arise naturally rather than forcing interpretations. Aleister appreciated this reminder. It aligned perfectly with the rhythm of learning he had come to trust: slow, steady, and grounded in awareness. Conversations with fellow students reflected the same sense of gradual expansion. Many described how their understanding deepened quietly as they revisited familiar concepts through a broader lens. These shared insights reassured Aleister that he was not alone in adjusting to this new stage. The sense of community, though subtle, provided a gentle support that helped him stay balanced as he moved forward. Outside the order, his evening walks remained an essential part of his process. The soft light of London streets, the familiar sound of distant footsteps, and the calm flow of the river all offered space for the day's lessons to settle. He often found himself pausing on quiet corners, noticing how the city's patterns echoed the structure of the teachings: repetition, rhythm, and gentle variation. His notebooks became filled with reflections that showed a new kind of clarity. He wrote about the way advanced concepts connected to earlier lessons, how patterns in symbolic study mirrored the patterns of his own thoughts, and how steady discipline made complex ideas feel approachable rather than overwhelming. These entries helped him see that growth continued to happen in small, consistent steps. After several months of steady progress, his mentors told him he was approaching a point where the advanced studies would begin to integrate with his deeper introspection. They explained that this next phase would invite him to connect broader symbolic patterns with the quiet awareness he had developed over time. Their tone was calm and encouraging, reminding him that he was ready because he had walked the earlier stages with patience and sincerity. Aleister felt a gentle readiness for what lay ahead. The path no longer felt like a sequence of steps, but a continuous unfolding, a journey that expanded naturally as long as he approached it with steadiness. And as he prepared to continue, he did so with the quiet confidence of someone who trusted the slow, enduring rhythm of his own inner work. As Aleister moved into the phase where advanced study blended with deeper introspection, he found the teachings encouraging a more seamless connection between inner awareness and the wider symbolic patterns he'd been exploring. His mentors explained that this stage was meant to help students see how the subtle movements of the mind reflected the broader structures found in the Order's teachings. It was not about uncovering hidden truths, but about recognizing the quiet parallels between inner experience and the symbolic language he had grown familiar with. Aleister approached this integration with the same calm patience he had developed over the months. During his morning reflections, he practiced observing how certain ideas resonated differently depending on his state of mind. He noticed how clarity expanded when he was steady and present, and how meaning felt distant when his thoughts drifted. These realizations reminded him that understanding was not fixed, but shifted gently based on awareness. In meetings, mentors guided students through discussions that wove together foundational symbols with more nuanced interpretations. They encouraged everyone to look not for definitive answers but for patterns, connections that revealed how the mind processed meaning over time. Aleister found these conversations grounding. They reminded him that the symbolic systems were not separate from personal experience. They were reflections of it, shaped by attention and intention. Conversations with fellow students also took on a deeper tone. Many shared how advanced concepts felt less overwhelming when approached with the steady discipline they had developed earlier. Their reflections reassured him that everyone was adjusting to this broader perspective at their own pace. The sense of shared progress helped him feel anchored as he navigated through increasingly layered material. Outside the Order, Aleister's evening walks through London continued to mirror his inner process. He noticed how the city's gentle rhythms, shifting lights, subtle architectural patterns, the quiet movement of the river, seemed to echo the teachings he studied. These observations didn't feel mystical. They simply brought a sense of harmony, as though the world around him was quietly reinforcing what he was learning. His notebooks reflected this deepening connection. He wrote about how advanced symbols revealed new facets of thought, how inner clarity allowed meaning to emerge more naturally, and how the discipline of earlier stages made it easier to remain steady in the face of complex ideas. These entries showed him that he was not so much learning something new as expanding his ability to perceive what he had been studying all along. After several months of this gradual integration, his mentors informed him that he was nearing a point where his studies would turn toward the refinement of understanding, an inward polishing that brought together discipline, intention, and symbolic awareness. They explained that this next phase would feel quieter, more subtle, and would build on everything he had patiently cultivated. Aleister felt a calm readiness settle within him. The journey ahead did not feel like a challenge, but a continuation, a natural unfolding of the same gentle rhythm he had followed since the beginning. And as he prepared for the next stage, he trusted that each lesson would continue revealing itself with the same steady clarity that had guided him this far. As Aleister entered the stage devoted to refining understanding, he felt the teachings becoming quieter and more subtle, as though each idea was now meant to be sensed rather than fully explained. His mentors described this phase as a gentle polishing, where everything he had learned, discipline, intention, symbolic awareness, and introspective steadiness, came together in a softer, more integrated way. Instead of focusing on new material, the Order encouraged him to revisit familiar concepts with clearer eyes, noticing how their meaning shifted depending on his state of mind. Aleister approached this refinement with a calm openness. During his morning practices, he focused on simple exercises that deepened awareness of his inner space. He found that when he was still and attentive, familiar symbols revealed quieter layers of meaning he hadn't noticed before. These weren't dramatic realizations, but subtle insights that appeared like small ripples spreading gently across the surface of his thoughts. In group meetings, mentors guided discussions that emphasized how understanding matured over time, often growing clearer only after months of steady practice. They encouraged students to trust the slow pace of learning, reminding them that insight was something that unfolded naturally rather than something to be pursued. Aleister found this perspective grounding, especially as he realized how much calmer and more stable his mind had become since he had begun this journey. Conversations with fellow students remained supportive and reflective. Many shared how the refinement stage helped them see the simplicity beneath ideas that once seemed complex. Hearing these experiences helped Aleister appreciate his own progress, reminding him that the quiet clarity he felt had been built gradually through patience and consistency. Outside the Order, his walks through London continued to serve as moments of quiet assimilation. The familiar rhythm of the city, the steady flow of people, the dim glow of lamps, and the calm movement of the river seemed to match the soft refinement taking place within him. He often paused on quiet bridges, noticing how his thoughts settled naturally into stillness, as though mirroring the water below. His notebooks became filled with reflections that were less analytical and more observational. He wrote about how understanding felt less like reaching for something, and more like allowing it to emerge. His entries captured subtle shifts in awareness, moments where ideas connected in unexpected ways or where a familiar symbol suddenly felt clearer. These observations reassured him that refinement was not about mastery but about presence. After some time, his mentors told him that he was approaching the point where this long period of study would begin transitioning into a broader, more outward phase, one where he would learn to apply his clarity beyond personal introspection. They emphasized that he did not need to rush. The shift would come naturally, just as every stage before had. Aleister felt a quiet sense of readiness. The journey no longer felt like a path he was following, but like a steady rhythm he had become part of over time. And as he looked toward the final phase ahead, he did so with calm confidence, trusting the gentle unfolding that had guided him from the very beginning. As Aleister entered the final phase of this long cycle of study, he felt a calm sense of transition settling over him, as though the inward rhythm he had followed for so long was now gently expanding outward. His mentors explained that this stage was less about learning new teachings and more about recognizing how deeply the earlier lessons had become part of him. They spoke softly about how true understanding revealed itself not in dramatic insight, but in the steady way a person carried their awareness into daily life. This message resonated with him. He realized that the months of disciplined practice, introspection, and symbolic study had created a quiet foundation, one that shaped the way he thought, listened, observed, and moved through the world. During his morning reflections, he found himself approaching familiar exercises with a new kind of ease. The techniques that once required effort now felt natural, almost intuitive, as if they were extensions of his own attention. He didn't feel the need to search for deeper meaning. The clarity arose on its own, unfolding gently in the spaces between thoughts. In meetings, mentors guided students through discussions about carrying inner steadiness into broader experience. They encouraged them to see how the values cultivated in the Order, patience, presence, and awareness, could support decisions, relationships, and daily challenges outside the walls of study. Aleister appreciated this shift. It helped him see that the purpose of his journey was not to retreat from life, but to meet it with greater calm and understanding. Conversations with fellow students reflected a shared sense of quiet transformation. Many spoke about how their perspectives on everyday situations had changed, how they reacted more thoughtfully, listened more deeply, and found clarity where confusion once existed. These reflections reassured Aleister that he too had shifted in gentle but meaningful ways. Outside the Order, his walks through London took on a new softness. The familiar glow of street lamps, the murmured conversations drifting from storefronts, and the steady movement of the river all seemed to blend with the inner stillness he had cultivated. He moved through the city with a sense of quiet connection, noticing details he once overlooked. Patterns in architecture, the cadence of footsteps, the gentle interplay of light and shadow. His notebooks reflected this broader perspective. He wrote less about specific exercises and more about the gentle clarity shaping his day-to-day experiences. He described moments of calm decision-making, the ease of thoughtful communication, and the subtle recognition that understanding had become part of the way he lived, rather than something he consciously reached for. After some time, his mentors gathered him privately to acknowledge the completion of this phase. They reminded him that the journey was ongoing, that each insight would continue to mature, each practice deepen, and each moment of awareness ripple into the next. Their tone was warm and steady, offering reassurance rather than finality. Aleister received their words with quiet gratitude. He didn't feel a sense of ending, but a soft continuation, as if the path he had followed inward was now guiding him outward with the same gentle rhythm. And as he stepped into this new chapter, he carried with him everything the journey had taught him: patience, clarity, discipline, and a calm sense of meaning that would continue unfolding one steady moment at a time.